Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another one of the exciting form lecture series for the graduate program, and specifically for everyone doing graduate thesis this summer at SCI-Arc. You guys know who I am. I'm Marika Trotter. I am the head of history and theory here at SCI-Arc, and I am super excited to introduce today's speaker. Dr. LeRonn P. Brooks is an associate curator for modern and contemporary collections at the Getty Research Institute, where he heads their African American History Initiative. Now, this is a new program at the Getty, and LeRonn is the inaugural curator in his role. As that institution turns its attention to Black art and architecture and their histories to a degree that it has not in the past. Now, being the first in a new role is kind of like being the first animal who manages to fly or float to a new island that's just been created by a volcanic eruption or something. You get to both make your mark, but you've also got to make your home. And on both fronts, what you do carries risks and also sets an example. So needless to say, I'm excited to follow the move that LeRonn makes. Some of the things that he's done already include acquiring the archive of Los Angeles artist Betty Sayre, a key player in the Black arts movement, the photographic archive of the Johnson Publishing Company, who published Ebony and Jet magazines, and as well as acquiring with USC, with Milton Curry over at USC, acquiring the archive of Paul R. Williams, the 20th century architect, which was erroneously believed to have been destroyed by fire during the 1992 Rodney King uprising in Los Angeles. And LeRonn is at least going to start off today by talking to us about some of the material in that collection. LeRonn holds a PhD in art history from CUNY and a BFA from Hunter College in New York. He's published and lectured widely, and he comes to Los Angeles from Lehman College, New York, where he was assistant professor in the Department of African Studies. And I'm also excited to say that LeRonn will be teaching one of our 4-track electives, yay, here at SCI-Arc in the fall. Welcome, LeRonn. We are so glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me, and good to meet everyone. And I hope this is interesting. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. Excuse me. Keep it there for a minute. Founded by the Reverend Richard Allen in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1816, the first African Methodist Episcopal Church is today one of the oldest African-American congregations in America and one of the largest African-American congregations in California. From slavery through segregation, Black churches were sanctuaries of worship, organizing, and communion without interference or the discrimination many had experienced in the larger Methodist Church. And by sanctuary, let's begin with these working definitions. 1, a holy or sacred place. 2, a building or room for religious worship. 3, the protection from danger or a difficult situation that is provided by a safe place. And for a politically active church, the latter definition is important here. 3, the protection from danger or a difficult situation that is provided by a safe place. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, was the first major religious denomination in the United States, founded as a form of protest against slavery and racial discrimination in organized religion. What's more, many AME churches were important stops on what was the Underground Railroad, through which many of the enslaved found freedom in the North or toward the South in Mexico. The denomination in Los Angeles was founded in 1872 by Bridget Biddy Mason.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Oh, there you go. Now it's full screen.
Seeing it here.
Okay, perfect.
Cool. And I'm going to be going back and forth between that, that, and then the lecture. She arrived as a slave in Los Angeles with her owner, a man named Robert Smith, in 1856. However, since California was a free state, Mason, with the help of local Black and white abolitionists, successfully sued in court to win her freedom. And in 1872, Mason organized the first AME meeting in her own home, which 12 other people attended. The congregation remained very small, and their meetings were held alternatively in other members' homes. And during the 1880s, a migration of African Americans in Los Angeles increased, and the first AME became more popular, particularly among middle-class African Americans. The first permanent church was established in 1903 on 8th and Tome. And here we see one of the meeting houses, and here we see the church on 8th and Tome. It was located in the African-American business district, and the Gothic-style church became a community landmark. After spending 5 years enslaved in a free state, Bridget Mason challenged Smith, her owner, the person who owned her body, and the court for her freedom. And on January 19th, 1856, she petitioned for herself and her extended family of 13 people. And Los Angeles District Judge Benjamin Hayes took 3 days before handing down his ruling in favor of Mason and her extended family, citing California's 1850 Constitution, which prohibited slavery. As the congregation grew, the church moved into a succession of homes: 10th in Georgia, 1st in Maine, San Pedro Street, and finally, it moved to the 8th and Southtown Church. In 1968, First AME, founded by Biddy Mason nearly a century earlier, moved to its current location at 2270 South Harvard Boulevard in Southwest Los Angeles, into a late modern style building designed by Paul R. Williams. But on an August Sunday, 5 years earlier in 1963, a brigade of supporters and members, each equipped with a gold-plated shovel, broke ground for that new $1 million church building. Over 2,000 watched movie stars Marlon Brando and Tony Curtis, along with civic and religious dignitaries, turn over the soil for First AME's new sanctuary. And John Factor, half-brother of cosmetics mogul Max Factor, had supplemented the congregation's building fund with a $200,000 donation. As the oldest and largest African-American church in Los Angeles, First AME, led by Pastor Dr. H. Harford Brookins, had successfully extended its ministry and services. The church and its ever-growing congregation needed a new building with additional facilities. The new complex, designed by Williams, would seat 5,000, have a 150-seat chapel, an auditorium with space for 700, and additional seating for 600 people. It would also be equipped with a stage, dining facilities, and other conveniences. The plan also included underground parking, medical and consulting facilities, a private chapel, and administration services. Williams designed the building to rise from an elevated foundation to accommodate the irregularly shaped hillside lot and maximize the effect of its elevated location. And here again, let's look at the church. Here you see the zigzag design right across. Decorative murals are painted between the bays of the west facade. Amongst other, a zigzag motif used along the roofline and the porch of the front entrance enlivens the simple stucco exterior of the building. Decorative murals painted between the bays of the west facade heighten the sort of design effect. Amongst other achievements, Williams was the first African-American member of the American Institute of Architects and a lifetime member of First AME. Born in Los Angeles in 1894, Williams, his parents had been members of the church after arriving from Memphis, Tennessee. He was married at First AME and his funeral was held at First AME. Designing the building was no doubt as great an honor as it was to sit in the church, to sing and share sanctuary in the church, week after week. Walk with me here. And at the groundbreaking ceremonies in 1963, a grand sermon was held on the grass with Williams in attendance. Lawn chairs replaced the church pews, and the open air above the congregation served as that day's ceiling. And under that ceiling of blue sky and clouds, they may have sung a hymn from founder Richard Allen's own hymnal. Maybe Don't Fall on Me. I'll read it for you. Oh, rocks, don't fall on me. Oh, rocks, don't fall on me. Oh, rocks, don't fall on me. Rocks and mountains don't fall on me. Look over yonder on Jericho's wall. Rocks and mountains don't fall on me. And see those sinners tremble and fall. Rocks and mountains don't fall on me. In that great judgment day, rocks and mountains don't fall on me. The sinners will run to the rocks and say, rocks and mountains don't fall on me, when every star refuses to shine. Rocks don't fall on me. I know King Jesus will be mine. Rocks and mountains don't fall on me. The trump or the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall rise. Rocks and mountains don't fall on me, and go to mansions in the skies. Rocks and mountains don't fall on me. The hymn is rooted in a truth hoped for despite the facts of the world, that living a life will lead to a righteous place. It is a meditation on the aspiration for salvation and judgment, faith and consequence, or even faith, truth, and death. The repeated refrains are stacked atop one another as a matter of persistence and devotional duration. A wall of prayer, if you will, against the harsh world of racial segregation outside the church's doors. Here on this day, only in the open air. But the space they held outside as church had become a facsimile for the building itself. And the challenge to Williams was of how he could create a structure that represented the very sanctuary they held in their hearts. And how could he steward the intimacy and momentum of communion that had begun almost a century ago in the home of Biddy Mason, who too understood the unique importance of sanctuary for African Americans. Because within a larger context, the 1960s were a precarious decade for Black communities in America. In 1963, the year of the groundbreaking, African Americans did not have their right to vote protected. And a few years earlier, the Freedom Riders had risked their lives traveling on Greyhound buses through the American South in the effort to desegregate interstate travel for everyone, and to a larger degree, challenge this nation to live up to the promises of democracy. And on this day, today, June 2021, I wonder about their thoughts of sanctuary and the architect they'd hired designed the structure that would represent, house, exemplify, and protect their happiness, their solidarity, their faith in their children. First AME was a structure as an object. As an object is itself a hymnal in architectural form. Williams was, of course, a master of many styles, but for all of his more famous buildings and celebrity associations, the architect was as much a pillar of his community as he was the draftsman of buildings that defined individual lives. But here we're talking about a space much closer to home. And I say this as a way of asking, or better yet, questioning, how we think about the relationship between form and function in relationship to community, design, and object. Here, it is a case of form following function, but if the function of the building is sanctuary for a formerly enslaved, as had been for Biddy Mason, for the formerly enslaved, and here in 1963, an aspirant community living in the shadow of Jim Crow, right? How then are we charged today? How then are we given the duty to rethink a structure or an object's relationship to the idea of community, to law, to history, to myth. When Williams died in 1980, his funeral was held at First AME. The building he had designed 17 years earlier. Pastor Cecil Murphy wrote of his childhood, Williams not only designed buildings, he designed lives. To paraphrase his granddaughter, Williams' own granddaughter, Karen Hudson, regarding her grandfather's relationship to the church, it was from the cradle to the grave. And these are the stakes of sanctuary, or the lack of. The use of the imagination to find some notion of truth through the created form, or the death of both the imagination and body for lack of speculative exploration in the first place. And like Williams's structure was imagined and then realized around truth, his truth, around the AME experience, what follows are 4 separate meditations on 4 artworks that are themselves objects, structures, for the contemplation of African-American life. And as with the hymn, "Oh, Rocks Don't Fall on Me," I like to begin with a sort of meditation on the notion of truth in art. In her essay, The Site of Memory from 1995, author Toni Morrison writes on this difference for a fiction writer between fact and truth. It's a long quote, so please indulge me a bit. Fact by definition is distinct. Fiction by definition is distinct from fact. Presumably, it's the production of imagination, invention, and it claims the freedom to dispense with what really happened, or where it really happened, or when it really happened. And nothing in it needs to be publicly verifiable, although much of it can be verified. By contrast, the scholarship of the biographer and the literary critic seems to us only trustworthy when the events of fiction can be traced to some publicly verifiable fact. It's the research of the, quote, "Oh yes, this is where he or she got it from," unquote, school, which gives its own credibility from excavating the credibility of the sources of the imagination, not the nature of the imagination. The work that I do frequently falls in the minds of most people into the realm of fiction called fantastic or mystic. With these labels, I consider my single gravest responsibility in spite of that magic is not to lie. When I hear someone say, quote, "Truth is stranger than fiction," unquote, I think that old chestnut is truer than we know. Because it doesn't say that truth is truer than fiction, just that it's stranger, meaning that it's odd. It may be excessive, it may be interesting, but the important thing is that it's random and fiction is not random. Therefore, the crucial distinction for me is not the difference between fact and fiction, but the distinction between fact and truth. Because facts can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot. Unquote. What follows is a working theory or a theory in the making of trying to understand objects that can be forms of sanctuary or spaces that carry the weight of the hymnal into speculative spaces, the strange, the odd, in the spectrum between truth and fact and the fragility of Black life. It's Paul Williams, First AME. "Oh, rocks don't fall on me." Storytelling, the first, Nary Ward, Jack Totem. This is Lamert Park, and that's the Jack Totem in the middle. That's Nary. The shades. Jack and the Beanstalk. While the story of Jack and the Beanstalk centers on food, artist Nary Ward pulls larger implications from the fable. In it, the character Jack and his elderly mother are destitute, desperate even. She sends him to the local market to sell the family cow for enough money to buy provisions. En route, he meets a man who offers him a handful of beans, the most beautiful beans he'd ever seen, in exchange for the cow. Enamored with the beans and not the cow, Jack listens as the stranger explains that once planted, the beans will grow into the sky, the place of dreams and dreaming overnight. And overnight they did grow, and so did Jack's thoughts of striving and prosperity. So as Jack took hold of what was a giant stalk, his climbing was heartened by thoughts of how his family's fortunes could change for the better. No falling now, the only direction is up, he thought. A play on the tale, Nary Ward's Jack Totem. A wayward stalk is comprised of truck parts, car jacks, as well as metal serving bowls and bootlaces. Oh. And here's a close-up. This located in historic Leimert Park, the sculpture becomes a metaphor for a neighborhood embedded with the dreams of African-American strivers in a metaphorical dialogue bound to the notion of enchantment, of chance and change. The jacks, car and truck jacks, are metaphors for lifting. The silver mixing bowls, vessels for holding food, and this preparation and serving. Each is a verb and instrument of action. And the laces harken back to civil rights leader and educator Booker T. Washington and his belief that African Americans should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. But the irony of that philosophy is that without communal support, the very possibility of Black social mobility would be but a dream. Jack and the Beanstalk details the journey of a single hero. The story of African American strivers is a story of generations of Black Jacks who found something quite different in the clouds. Jack thought the stalk would be easy to climb, but he didn't have the seemingly relinquishing weight, nor the legacy of racial segregation to carry. The African-American population in Los Angeles reached nearly 16,000 during the 1920s. And that number rose dramatically during the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the city, increasing to over 60,000 by World War II. But decades earlier, by the time developer Walter H. In 1927, racial segregation was still legal in the United States. In California, both African and Asian Americans were subject to Jim Crow era laws that affected their access to quality education, meaningful employment, and the areas in the state and city in which they could aspire to live. These race-based residential ordinances or covenants were meant to restrict the ability of upwardly mobile Asian and African American strivers to live in areas of the city with better quality homes and amenities, parks. This language of restriction was written into deeds and could keep property from being sold to or bought by non-whites. In-kind covenants were used against African-American families who attempted to move to West Adams or South Harvard Boulevard, where AME Church is located. There were also numerous sundown towns in California, such as Glendale and Hawthorne, where Black people risked their lives if they dared stay after dark. And there was also the very real threat of mob violence if a Black family dared move into an all-white community, such as Leimert Park during the first half of the 20th century. It seems if upwardly mobile African Americans had even tried to climb the stalk born from beans they'd actually earned, the wall of racial segregation and legal discrimination would rise even higher. But whether the threat of vigilante violence or Jim Crow era laws, the ultimate threat for whites in these communities was the presence of Black culture, especially the forms of sociality and culture around food, for example. The Southern culinary traditions Black migrants brought with them to Los Angeles was authentically tied to other Black cultural forms that immersed themselves into American popular mainstream culture. In this way, the preparing and consuming of soul food was as cathartic and inseparable from the blues, jazz, R&B, and rock and roll music. Black culture exists as the root and along every branch of American culture. Thusly, the delicious sounds and smells that would possibly emerge from the windows of Black homes expressed a form of power and their deep authenticity. If only in the realization that much of what white Americans love about American culture, the jazz, the rock and roll they listen to, or the fried chicken they ate, begins in some way with Black culture. From the music on the radio to whatever is new on the dance floor and those godly tufts of scent rising from the chicken frying in the skillet. The spirit of food calls back ancestry. It is its own sanctuary. The skill and labor in preparing it, as well as the creation of prayers and praying over it, it is all as spiritual as it is physical. Food takes us on as much of a journey as we have taken it, across the Atlantic in the hulls of slave schooners with recipes woven into our thoughts and along every tree branch, like sketch with those spiritual and geographic connections. Ward led a procession of traditional African drummers in a ritual and symbolic migration around Leimert Park and his Jack totem. And in the park, they formed a smaller circle around the sculpture that was no sculpture. It was an embodiment of dialogue between the tale of a mythic event and a part of American history so epic it aspires to myth. The sculpture itself was both an intersection and a symbol of this exchange. The artist also created a persona of the enchanted server and created speculative tools reminiscent of both food serving utensils and ritual objects. As a spoonful of food is a magic object in the eyes of the hungry, and a handful of magic beans is itself a meal for the imagination, strivers like Jack exist in the imaginary future only reached by climbing, effort, and dreaming. And on the same day as Ward's concentric migration around Leimert Park, a row of Black-owned food trucks lined the street in front. Faith Ringgold, Law. Now, the title of the painting, I won't say the complete title of the painting because it just won't sit right on my soul today, just to say that repeatedly, so I will say Die-En. But Ringgold uses this title strategically because that's what she was called often. On November 13, 1970, Faith Ringgold was arrested for her participation in the flag show at Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village. At the time, there were protests against the war in Vietnam in every city, including New York, and a member of the People's Flag Show Committee had organized a show. Ringgold was in line with the seemingly ubiquitous spirit of mass protest and the challenging of then President Richard Nixon's increasingly authoritarian style of governance. But more specifically, by using the American flag as the show's theme, the committee And the only 200 and the nearly 200 artists therein were attempting to explore the diminishing limits of the First Amendment and a metaphorical proxy war here at home. The years of anti-war protests, Black rebellion, and assassinations of Black revolutionaries during the 1960s provides a necessary context for the arrest of the People's Flag Show, at the People's Flag Show, and of Ringgold herself. Now, I know I'm running out of time here. It's 2:32 already, so I'll try to move forward toward the point. Exhibited at the flag show, Black Light, the painting you just saw, Black Light 10, Die N, gets to the heart of the matter. The painting expresses the artist's exasperation and concern regarding the billions of dollars spent on the US space program while millions of Americans lived in poverty. What's more, placed within the flag's stars are the word die, and within the stripes, the word N can be read. The work is at one time at once existential and true in its bitter juxtaposition of liberty and hate to anyone with an understanding of the treatment of African Americans in this country, from the Middle Passage to hundreds of years of chattel slavery, through legal segregation, and extending to the murder of George Floyd and every other name we dare to remember. Gil Scott-Heron's Whitey on the Moon, released in 1970, a year after Ringgold's painting, presents a series of striking in-kind contrasts of African-American life within this democracy, covering issues such as medical debt, poverty, bills, inequitably rising inflation, and pestilence. I don't have time here to go over the poem. But let's think about the inequity Ringgold is talking about here. While the Apollo capsule, and the Apollo was the ship that the capsule that went to the moon. While the Apollo capsule was navigating the blackness of space, Black people were navigating the inherent biases and legacies of slave and segregationist laws. What does it mean for a people who are not considered lawful human beings to think the flag would or will protect them as citizens? And what does it mean for a Black person to pledge allegiance to that flag? What loyalty are we assuming? And exactly what loyalty was being shown to Black people? The flag, but a collection of memories, stars bound together in proximity as a metaphor for unity between independent parts, states and laws, geographically and geometrically bound in close proximity to the idea of land, and a conceptual unity that undergirds the rule of federal law. The 238,900 miles between Earth and the moon, psychically no longer than the last stretch of field for the enslaved between slave and free states. Ringgold's flag is a topography of the cast America has placed on African Americans, as well as a Jim Crow sound image. But where is sanctuary? I'll skip to the last image to leave room for questions in the time we have here. This is the photographer Herb Robinson's Metro series. He traveled the subways of New York, the Tube in London, and subway in Paris, and just took shots, photographs of people in transition in these spaces. The title of this section is Nowhere. During the morning rush in Harlem on the 125th Street subway platform, the muses of the underground ring sparks from the rails as the downtown A train express enters the station. And from the dark tunnel, the silver train itself, dusted with years of wear, erupts as if from Hades dreaming into the station's light, a shawl of shadow draping its waist. From the platform, strap hangers angle their way into the train cars, forming for themselves a public of bodies filling the train's interior. Bound together in an odd puzzle of flesh, each person holds onto lifelines of sight. Every inch of open space claimed as an eye's property for the duration of the ride. And because of this close proximity, distance itself becomes tangible or felt in the spaces people make for themselves in frames of a slow waiting, even on the express from moment to moment, from stop to stop. Is there sanctuary in these dark stretches of distance? Photographer Herb Robinson asks. He asks of us. The photographs capture a perfect nowhere created by the kinds of erasure or the unsafety, the unsanctuary of one's own memory as tied to place, to structures, to homes, to streets, and the kinds of ephemera that summon the recollections and memories of one's life in an order that raises them from fact to the truth of an instance of human connection, stitched together to build a chain of lucid memories, stacked together as stanzas, as a wall of bricks, as a poem, an accumulation that we call years. But erasure undoes both sanctuary. In her 2011 book, Harlem is Nowhere, A Journey into the Mecca of Black America, author Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, in writing about her friend, an elderly woman named Miss Bessie, who I also had the pleasure of knowing in my days in Harlem. Here's what Sharifa writes about Miss Bessie. Quote, Miss Bessie once said that there wasn't anyone left, that she would like to go home, but there wasn't anyone at home. If there isn't anyone there any longer, there's almost no question that her letters weren't received. They are all scattered, they're all gone. If she hadn't mentioned them to me, I would have thought to ask. Miss Bessie's letters are not at all the kind of thing you can expect to find at Mr. Schomburg's library, because they are not, in his sense, evidence of anything of much importance. They would give evidence of a girl going through a small place, going from a small place to a much larger place, evidence of the people she left behind, those she came to know, of the places that gave her shelter that are no longer there, of the cruelties she suffered at the hands of people who are long gone. The letters are gone, and so is the building across the street from Miss Bessie, where Miss Bessie once lived. She points to the towers of Lenox Terrace. They were erected where tenements and brownstones once stood, raised during the hyperactive slum clearance programs of the 1950s. Miss Bessie remembers all of the addresses of all the buildings where she ever lived in Harlem. She sometimes plays their digits in combination for the daily number, along with the addresses of the buildings where her sisters lived, and the birthdays of her sisters, and the birthdays of her dead husband and dead children, unquote. Miss Bessie was one of the many elderly old-time Harlemites who stood on Harlem streets during the early morning like attendant figures guarding ancient temples on causeways named after Black people who had made the neighborhood proud. Their eyes passing along the bustling avenue slowly, as if in remembrance of histories she understood not to speak or take lightly. And in that meditation, I'd like to leave it here, this idea of sanctuary in the time that we have. And this idea of sanctuary beginning with the church, beginning with architecture, and the question of sanctuary in objects that exemplify myth, law, storytelling, right? And so it's a working theory. And thank you for everyone for sitting through this. Thank you.
Thank you, LeRonn. That was beautifully delivered with conviction and poetry. And I very much appreciate this, your willingness to present a kind of in-process series of meditations, let's say, on the idea of sanctuary. I want to open it up to people that were, there are other people on the live stream, but there are also some people that have joined us in the Zoom space for questions and comments.
LeRonn, if you don't mind, I'll just say something. First of all, thank you so much for presenting such a powerful and searching talk. And there are so many, it promotes in me so many associations and thoughts. But I think one of the strongest was your description of the object as a verb, as an object that kind of acts. And it really brought to mind, to me, the work of a great teacher. Maybe you're familiar with him, Robert Farris Thompson.
I helped acquire his archive for the Getty.
Oh, well, okay. And so I feel in some way his kind of spirit is here. But to me, his reading of African sculpture, primarily classical, of reading it in terms of icon and act.
You're very close to the source.
So,
You're very close to the source. You are exactly.
But I feel this quality of that he would call vital aliveness that would irrigate solid objective form with this massive cultural potentiality to transmit lineage, to convey ancestrality, and also to lay the ground of a possible future that could be brought out through acts of embodiment and collective being. So I just want to, as he would say, kind of salute that kind of spirit in this material, and I feel that it's very powerful in what you've said.
Thank you very much. You know, the theory of mutation, cultural mutation, right? That across the Black Atlantic you have. And so, for instance, when I was teaching at Lehman, in the Bronx, hip hop was created 5 blocks from the campus, right? And some of the movements in hip hop culture, and specifically the aspect of breakdancing, looked so very similarly to West African and Mali, West African initiation performance, right? And so there's certain things that are brought across in terms of memory, in terms of cultural retention, that find new sort of manifestations. And so beginning, you're really close. So beginning with someone like Paul Williams as a source, or better yet, Biddy Mason, right? Her body being owned and then actually working and petitioning for her freedom, using the law to get her freedom, and the idea of sanctuary being embedded, coming from a history of non-protection, being sanctuary, and that extends to Paul Williams and his idea, right? Because, he's a very famous architect, but he sang with the people in the pews. He was married there. He was ingrained in that particular church, and so his understanding of the structure and the culture of the environment no doubt influenced the ways in which he understood how the culture performed in church, actually from the singing to everything, could inform a structure. So if we think about cultural retention, what does it mean for African American artists to sort of deal with this idea of sanctuary or non-sanctuary, and how can we find, or the spirit of it, right? Because Robert Farris Thompson flashed with the spirit, right? How can we find the spirit of it in other forms of making that deal similarly with the same thing: law, myth, inheritance? And so it's a working theory, but this is why I'm here, because I want to engage it. I want to put it out there to the world. And so who knows what it may find? And here you go, saying Robert Farris Thompson. I ate dinner with him every night for a week in New Haven as I was preparing his archive.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering how that might condense in a reading of the formal moves that are made in the first AME church. You talked about the folded plate on the porch, for example, and also about the fact that the building is kind of set into, but also maybe exaggerating the hill of the site. What are your, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What are your thoughts on that, and about how that might be pulling through the language of architecture, some specific notion of sanctuary?
Well, I think it's a complicated, it may not look, but it's a complicated design, right? And so you have the zigzag, you have side sort of making do. I mean, a lot of it speaks to the ways in which African American, so within that context, right? So if we do a social history, right, in relationship to the object, within that particular context, there were so many ways in which African Americans had to adapt to society, right? So for instance, if we're dealing with 1963 and our right to vote wasn't protected, that means that if in the South, my grandfather, right, my parents grew up in racial segregation in Alabama, if my grandfather wanted to vote, he would go to the courthouse and they would say, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? And he would say 10,000. They could say 10,001. You can't vote. That's what it means to not have your right to vote protected, right? And so there are so many ways in which we had to improvise in order to feel like ourselves, that we were citizens of this country, right? And so when you see a structure made by Paul Williams or an African-American architect at that time, a lot of it depends upon improvisation or the ways in which life has informed one's practice. Now, he did many different styles, right? Many different styles. And some of that has to do with, what are people's expectation of an African-American professional? Because segregation wasn't just for Black people, it was also for white people, because you were underexposed to Black people. So what does it mean that this Black professional is now an architect, is going to help you build a home or an office building? This may be your first exposure to an African-American professional, right? And so in that kind of meeting, he had to improvise or come up with ways with which to prove in order to get the building done. And so when we see different kinds of forms, it could be ornamental, it could be, not so ornamental, but more functionally based or what have you, a lot of it depends on the kinds of diversity, the kinds of imagination, not only with the earth, right, the hillside, but the social imagination. And what does it mean to build a structure that could accommodate your community when a lot of the dominant Methodist Church, a lot of the practices were discriminatory. The beginning of the first AME or the African Methodist Episcopal Church, like Black colleges, we didn't have access, or we had to sit in the balcony of a church because we were Black, right? And so there's so much that goes into the thought of what does it mean for an African American architect to make a building for his own community? It's complicated,
And you're saying that you think there would be a way of reading the church and its kind of complicated form language. I have to go now take a look. I want to see like the plans and stuff and the interior.
Yeah, see the plans, everything that's in the archive. I know you said in the presentation, like the archive. We're unpacking the archive.
Okay.
COVID was, we're unpacking.
I bet. Totally fair. I'm just now curious. Like I want to see if one could read the church in all of its variety and all of its thickness as an architectural object, as something that would also act in that way.
I'm hearing dissertations. I'm hearing journal articles.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I kind of feel like that's why I'm here, to provoke those thoughts by which scholarship. So one of the things that we've done with the African American Art History Initiative at the Getty is that we've had 2 fellowships for scholars to study the archives, specifically African American archives that we bring in. So it could be Betty Sarr or Robert Ferris Thompson, who dealt with the Black Atlantic. It could be Paul Williams. It could be a number of people, and so the kinds of thoughts I'm trying to provoke with this presentation are the imaginative possibilities of what can be done when you combine social histories with the thought of design, fine art, architecture, right? So it wasn't so much giving a forensic account of the room to room to room. It was about juggling or provoking a feeling of activism. Yeah. Provoking a feeling of Provoking the feeling of being in a moment in which people had to be politically active in order to move things forward. And why can't architecture be in there? Why can't design be in there? Why can't art history be in there? We have a place. And so,
well, yeah, I mean, I think you could even go farther than that and say that architecture, design, art, and the histories associated with those fields are already in that space. And when they choose not to be active, they're still making a choice and they're still involved.
That is very true. That's very true.
Can I add to this conversation? Marika, I'm sorry, I missed your intro. I couldn't find my Zoom link. Hi, LeRonn, my name is Mira. I'm also faculty at SCI-Arc, and I have so many things to ask you and kind of speak in front of you, but I'll just start with saying that, and maybe this is coming out of some of the language that John Cooper kind of was raising when he was asking about Robert Farris Thompson, but this idea of how we look at architecture, what are the ways in which we can start to look at architecture? What are and this idea of a kind of live read, and maybe this is because I don't have the language, I think that you have, but this idea of the kind of social history brought up against a reading of architecture and art as well, obviously, one that is oftentimes oriented around kind of formal reads, which are more static, let's say, like static formal reads being disrupted by a live read of building and art, let's say, but for this case, architecture, and how incredibly provocative that is for me in thinking about if we could say that in the history of architectural design, the formal reading, let's say the geometric formal reading or the reformal reading in classical sense, was a part of the generative process of making an piece of architecture.
I'm very sorry. Yeah, please, go ahead, please continue. I'm very sorry.
No problem. So if we could say that the formal ways of reading architecture, if the classical ways of reading architecture have been generative, have been generative for architects, what would it mean to maybe not replace, but add to this idea of a live read, and how that live read could actually become generative for an architect? Yeah. That's a really great question. I mean, because there's one thing about being a scholar or about being in the field. I mean, it's about the difference between being a scholar and what does it mean to be a practitioner, right? Because architects are often both, right? I went to art school. I was trained in painting. I'm an art historian, but I had to learn to be an art historian because I'm also a painter, right? And so what does it mean to actually be in the moment and you're actually engaging the object? I think that's fresh. I mean, there's one way that school can teach you to orientate yourself to the built structure, but there's another way that your life can teach you to do that. Right. And so, one of the things that I really think about is when you see a structure, how do you engage that structure? Do you engage it through the eyes of the people who taught you, or do you engage it through the eyes that you've grown for yourself in combination with the ways in which you've learned, right? And for me, engaging the structure historically through a social history, through reading of art and through reading of the possibilities of form and what form can contain, but also not forgetting that there's a larger context with which to associate it. I mean, that's my particular methodology, right? But I think look in proximity to other people who look at things differently at a structure. If you have a poet, if you have a friend who's a poet, if you have a friend who's a painter or a sculptor, think about how they look at the object. Right? Because for me to be so area specific in terms of how you've been trained, why not break that open? I often think about what conversations am I having? Who am I talking to? How am I being informed? Right? And how is it really enlivening me or engaging me? And how is that
changing or challenging the ways in which I see. And so for me to go through to painting, go to a sculpture, to think about poetry, to think about architecture, is all in line with breaking my notion of what I think architecture is and having it into a broader speculative space with which I'm interested. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
LeRonn, I had a quick comment. I was thinking about when you were saying unpacking. Thank you for your lecture, by the way. That what is the burden of the archivist? It's a particular kind of. We all have our
no pun intended.
Yeah, we all have our particular disciplinary burdens, and it was making me think of the essay "Unpacking My Library" by Walter Benjamin, where he talks about the chaos of it, and I think he sort of talks about it as a chaos. It's not a collection so much as it is a chaos of memories.
Yeah,
and I wonder if you also feel that burden.
Well, I often think about what's useful. When you see, or when I've seen an archive that's not organized, or it's in sort of, a really bad situation, I think about, first and foremost, what does it mean to actually be someone who wants to preserve that person's memory, right? And so I'm coming from somewhere. I have a purpose, right? And so I look at the circumstances based against my purpose, and I think it's not chaos. I have to make it make sense. Right? And the way that it can sort of make sense is the way that is useful, right? And that means something different for everybody,
Right, because you have to be aware of your audience, right?
You gotta be aware of your audience, but also aware of your own interests. What are the things that keep it going? When I was teaching, one of the things that I learned is that, you teach surveys and ultimately, if you like the Renaissance, I'm just talking about Leonardo for like a half an hour. Why am I talking about Leonardo for a half an hour? It's because maybe I'm just interested, right? And so, for me, what does it mean to sort of unpack an archive? Well, my thinking has to sort of match the challenge. Yeah. And so if I'm dealing with 4 different sort of vignettes in this lecture, I'm trying to challenge my own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to seem so proper that everything was so knit together. I'm trying to challenge my own. Can I handle 4 different objects in relationship to architecture? I think I can. And once one does that, what's on the other side? But what's useful?
But that's a kind of task where you're celebrating the gaps too. Yeah.
It's a road.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Unpacking. Well, I'm taking that note. Thank you.
Thank you, LeRonn, for the fantastic time that you spent with us. We are excited for your presence at our school. We're also excited that you are going to teach our students in fall. So this is the first one of many opportunity of encounter that our students will have with you. I also want to thank Marika for the great introduction and the faculty and students that were here today and that are following us live on live stream. A lot to think about, and thank you for contributing to expanding the archive of our architectural school. So it's a perfect topic for you to be speaking to. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, LeRonn.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.